Hi, welcome to the bathtub, where when you hear this music,
let's go surfing now, everybody's learning how. Come.
And we stop it really quick before you can get into it so we don't get sued, and then you hear this other music. Hold on a second. And we stop that really quick, not because we're afraid to be sued, but we just don't want to listen to God Save the Queen. And you see me wearing this hat, and you see me with a Union Jack, then you know, and you also see I brought my suntan lotion, which I'm going to throw away because I don't need that where I'm going. And I don't need this either. It makes me sweat. It makes my head swell up. We're going on a CORONACATION. This is our new theme show. CORONACATION is we do this in order to go on trips, flights of fancy to nations that we can't visit because we're staying home, trying to avoid getting the corona flu or meet anybody who supports Donald Trump. I'm sorry, I'm breaking my rule of no politics. I don't want to meet anyone who supports Donald Trump. And we don't go anywhere, and none of our bathers go anywhere. We stay at home, we stay in the bathtub, and I'm going to take you on a journey to another country. The only people who can go outside are people who go to Trump rallies. You can go to Trump rallies, but only if you don't wear a mask. So everyone who wants to go to a Trump rally, go. Just don't wear a mask, and I have no problem with that. We're going to talk today about a book I wrote. I'm going to put a link below for the New Republic, a magazine I like reading and writing for. And I don't know if you can even see this. I don't even have a hard copy, but it's called Square Haunting by Francesca Wade. The subtitle is 5 Writers in London Between the Wars. And let me tell you the 5 writers before I forget, because I reviewed this and I keep forgetting all their names. H.D., the famous poet, well, sort of famous, H.D., Imagist poet, friend of Ezra Pound. She was an important editor in American who went to live in England. And Jane Ellen Harrison, an academic, a classicist. Eileen Power, another academic, one of the early women academics who got into some of the universities. She helped found the London School of Economics. Virginia Woolf, we've all heard more about Virginia Woolf than any of us need to know. And Dorothy, the great Dorothy L. Sayers, one of my favorites as far as bathtub reading. In fact, look at that, a dead body in the bathtub. You're not going to get, that's a perfect book for the bathtub, right? Dorothy L. Sayers' first Lord Peter Wimsey book, Whose Body? Okay, so the book is I'm going to talk about this because normally we don't do nonfiction in this pointless rambling talks that we give every week. But I enjoy this book a lot. It's a kind of a group biography. So it's a biography of these 5 different women who sort of knew each other and didn't know each other, and it's not entirely clear because there's not enough information on all of these women. But they all lived in a place called Mecklenburgh Square, I lived right around the corner from Mecklenburgh Square for the past 25 years. If I had any sort of skills in putting these terrible talks together, I would put a map up and I could cut to pictures of Mecklenburgh Square. It's this lovely little thing that you run into when you live in London. And all the years I lived in London, I used to kind of stumble on Mecklenburgh Square because there was no major tube stop in the square. It was kind of cut off. On one side is Coram's Fields, this great big huge park for kids. And then there's Brunswick Square. And then there's a child contact center, which is a horrible place, but it's right there in the middle of it. And then there's a little one way of getting to Mecklenburgh Square is this little long fenced-in path through all these trees. I used to walk my dog through there all the time. I love this little spot. And you go through this little almost like an alleyway, an outdoor alleyway with these fences on both sides. And you end up in this incredibly beautiful square. Big Georgian houses, big tall houses. There was a lovely square garden, one of those overgrown garden squares in the middle called Mecklenburgh Gardens, which you couldn't go into because it was one of the few garden squares in London that still had keys. You could only have you could only go in if you lived in the neighborhood and you had a key to the garden square. And I used to go once a year. There would be an open gardens, and I would sometimes go visit it. My wife and I, or my dog and I, would go walk through there. And it's surrounded all these places, all these amazing places. King's Cross is about two streets over. There's a great old haunted. If there's a haunted graveyard in London. I forget the name of it off the Gordon's. I forget the name of this. St. George Gardens, I want to say. A little rinky, rundown old cemetery that I used to love going to, and sitting around, have lunches there, and sit with my dog. And the foxes, there were fox burrows all through it. And it was this lovely little, but you couldn't really see Mecklenburgh Square unless you really knew it was there. And when I lived in London, very often I would kind of stumble, I would wander around, and I would find myself in Mecklenburgh Square and think, well, this is really lovely, and I'd forget how I got there. It was only when I lived in Tavistock's place, right down the road from the square, that I could actually know how to find my way there regularly and enjoyed it even more so. So there was a gym there. I used to take my son swimming all the time. I used to love that gym. So anyway, there was this little square, and the premise of the Square Haunting book, it doesn't take a heavy critical view of that period, but it does talk about how between the wars, a lot of kind of women intellectuals, kind of independent women who wanted to do academic work or literary work, most of them were academics of some sort, and young women moving to London ended up in Mecklenburgh Square because it was sort of cheap. It was kind of a bohemian area in London. And it was all the places, there were a lot of cheap bed sits, and it was close to the British Library. There's a lot of interesting stuff about being an academic woman in that time. I mean, women were not allowed in some of the libraries. I can't remember which ones. And the other thing that was really, really eye-opening and disturbing about that period was when women were in academia, if they got married, they couldn't keep their jobs. So I think that all of these things sort of contributed to some great independence on the type of women who lived in this area and who did a lot of scholarly work. And they didn't get married until they left the area, most of them. And Virginia Woolf was not an academic. She moved there briefly. She was briefly there after her flat was bombed in at the beginning of World War II, I think. Yeah, beginning of World War II. So there was this little spot that between the wars, between the Zeppelins going over and bombing, and then the Germans bombing in the beginning of the Battle of Britain, they had this kind of lovely little period when people just could work and write, and a lot of artists came there, and there's a lot of great writers who kind of came and went there. I want to talk just very briefly about some of the books I read and enjoyed. My least favorite was probably Aaron's Rod. I'm not a huge D.H. Lawrence fan, though I do like him and I want to read some more of him in the bathtub. Aaron's Rod I read for no other reason than that he writes a bit about Mecklenburgh Square in it. It's very loosely organized. There's no plot to it at all. It's about a guy who leaves his wife and kids. And Aaron's Rod, unfortunately, it's D.H. Lawrence, so it's referring to he plays the flute, but the fact that he has this rod that all the women like is a little bit obvious. And I think he breaks it at the end. I can't remember. There's some great writing in it. I think Lawrence wrote beautifully, and I liked a lot of his books. This is not my favorite book of his, but I enjoyed reading it for the period, and that was about it. H.D.'s poems. I'm not a huge fan of Imagism. I'm not a big fan of Ezra Pound, but I did enjoy reading many of the poems in Collected Poems in H.D., and I've read her off and on over the years. I don't know what it is about her, but I do quite like her. I couldn't find it. She wrote during her period in Mecklenburgh Square, as Francesca Way talks about. She had an affair with D.H. Lawrence. She had a kind of an open marriage with her husband, and Lawrence, the chick seemed to really like this guy. I don't know what it is about D.H. Lawrence. I don't know if it was the beard or he had the rod or whatever it was, but she was quite taken with him, and so was Dorothy Sayers. So they both seem to have had some sort of passionate relationship. Whether they slept with him or not, it's not clear. No one really cares, to my mind. But still, he had this big influence on some of these women, even though he came through briefly and lived in some of these bedsits that were all kind of crummy back then. And so much so that late in her life, many years later, when H.D. was being psychoanalyzed by Freud, this chick got around. She got psychoanalyzed. She went out with D.H. Lawrence, and she got psychoanalyzed by Freud. And she was still obsessed with this period of her life when she lived in Mecklenburgh Square. And she wrote an interesting, I can't find it now, sort of roman à clef about that period called Bid Time Return. I don't remember now. I want to say Bid Time Return. Very short novel, but sort of interesting picture of the time. So those are kind of the when you're going on your holiday, your imaginary holiday to Mecklenburgh Square, because you're not going to get out of the house, you're not going to get in the plane. Trust me, we're going to have a bit of a martini here. You're just going to stay home unless you're going to the Trump rally, and then you can go. You can ride your hog into the Trump rally and wave your flag around, and you don't have to wear a mask. I'm giving you my personal approval not to wear masks at the Trump rally. The best writer of the time who lived there, and I used to go to a pub called the Rugby Tavern. This is almost a Pointless Adventures in Literature. I spent so much time in Mecklenburgh Square and loved it. And the pubs around there and the restaurants and just the feel of the place. And there was a pub called the Rugby Tavern, which was right next door to where Dorothy Sayers and also HD had lived in there. I think they rented bed sits in the area. And she lived there. It was a cheap place to live. She was trying to do academic work, and then she had some horrible office job. And then in the middle of it, she wrote these really hilarious. If you have not read, we've talked about these briefly recently. The Dorothy L. Sayerses, Lord Peter Wimsey's. They're kind of a cross between Agatha Christie and P.G. Woodhouse. So there's this really kind of comic, over-rich, spoiled brat, middle-class guy named, middle-class in the British term, Lord Peter Wimsey. And he's got some sort of well-off family, and he just goes around and solves murders. And he's very funny. And then there's they have a little bit of a contraption of the plot. Excuse me. And there's a lot of these books. The one character who I liked a lot, and I can't remember when she shows up. I can't remember, but Harriet Vane was this kind of fascinating character who sort of makes you think about Dorothy Parker a lot. Finally, one of the writers who was not mentioned in this book, who was mentioned in the book, but was not one of the principal biographies in the book, was Hope Mirrlees. It's a Welsh name, I believe. And she was a partner. There was a partner of Jane Harrison, the academic Jane Harrison. She was 35 years younger than Harrison, who was her teacher at Oxford or Cambridge. Sorry, don't trust me for facts. And she was a student, and then she moved in with her. And there were a couple, I believe, but no one knows really too much about what was going on. And they were together for a long time. They seemed quite happy together. And in the course of it, Mirrlees was a poet. She wrote a very interesting kind of long poem called Paris, which is worth checking out. But she wrote this book called Lud in the Mist, which I read when I was about 16, when it came out, when this amazing, we've talked about the Lynn Carter Rediscovery series of fantasy classics. And Lynn Carter was this kind of terrible writer who produced these amazingly well-selected line of fantasy novels, and his introductions were useful. And it's a very funny, it is like many fantasy novels at the time, a sort of satire on middle-class England and legally bound England. And the joke is that it's set in another world, another fantasy world, where there's this kind of staid middle-class English-like country where everyone's lawyers and they just do really boring jobs. And there's north of the place called the Debatable Hills that live the fairies. And we don't know too much about the fairies, except that they're sending down fruit that makes everybody kind of go crazy. And people go there and they don't want to really come back. And it's a threat to the kind of hidebound dullness of middle-class England. It's a lovely book, really a lovely book. And this is a book that would be interesting to read if you're in your imaginary trip to Mecklenburgh Square, one of my favorite places in London. If you go there, there's probably a few monuments. I don't know what the hell they are, but you just walk around there. And now it's too expensive. You can't really, there's no bed sits there anymore or cheap rooming houses, but it's very expensive. But you can walk through it. You can walk through it and have a good time. Okay, so I'm going to stop. That's all I have to say, except that if you want to go on a holiday, you want to go on a coronation, then you can go to Merrie, England, and I'm going to say goodbye to you with this really disturbing national anthem. Okay? Here you go. Stay safe, England. Everybody stay safe, except the Trump rallies. Everybody stay safe. Okay, bye.